Hi guys, welcome back to the Earthy Delights podcast. Thank you for even having the courage to press play on this episode. I know this topic is seldom talked or thought about because as a society we find it so disgusting. That's precisely why we need to shine a light on it and bring it out of the shadows, because ignoring this problem isn't working. In this podcast we talk to Dr. James Cantor, who is a Canadian clinical psychologist and sexologist, specialising in hyper-sexuality and atypical sexual interests such as paedophilia. He is a former editor of the journal Sexual Abuse and an expert on paraphilia. We try to understand what makes a paedophile tick and what can be done to help those looking for help. I know this is a controversial topic, guys, but it really takes us to try to understand and have some level of compassion and empathy towards these afflicted people for us to be able to better deal with it as a society. Because quite simply, how we're dealing with it now really isn't working, as my own personal example would show. So I really urge you guys to listen to this. Dr. James Cantor is an amazing guest. He actually laces this podcast with comedy, of all things, when it's right, obviously. But his expertise and his knowledge is refreshing, because normally this topic is filled with so much hatred, and to get a more objective viewpoint is really helpful. I really actually enjoyed this podcast, I must say, and I came off with quite a high after we had this conversation with Dr. James. And I hope, if nothing else, this maybe allows you to see this whole subject from a different perspective and understand that what we're doing today isn't working, and that we need a shift in mentality for us to begin to solve this problem. Without further ado, here is Dr. James Cantor. Professor James Cantor, welcome to the Earthy Delights. Really delighted to have you on. What's the crack? How are you?
Pleased to be here. I live in Canada. I'm in Toronto right now, and of course, they're having a big election downstairs. So, as I've often said, there was a Broadway song for everything. This one is by Mel Brooks, which is "Hope for the best, expect the worst."
I think that could just capture 2020, couldn't it? In general, I hate to say it, but yeah, it's what a crazy year we've lived. Before we get into the belly of the beast here, I really want to just, like you said, it's really important for people to know that you're a professor, that you have studied and spent a lot of time working in this field. So you'll do it better than I will. Could you please just give me a bit of a background about yourself and how you kind of got into this line of work?
Sure. That was an easy question, then a hard question. I'm primarily a sex researcher, although I'm doing much more private practice now. And by just, dint of, I grew up a nerdy, math-oriented kind of kid, and I actually was planning on going into computer science to begin with. And so, I just had this technical background, and then essentially the thing that changed my life was just coming out as gay. That was, I was a bit of a laboratory nerd naturally, and just coming out, just again, changed the orientation of my life. No pun intended. I should say the trajectory of my life. This was now the late 80s, early 90s, a very, very different world. Sexual orientation issues, were really only just starting to get discussed in a productive way. And then the AIDS era took over, the entire field and our entire mindset. And that's when I decided to become a psychologist. I wanted to be able to help, other people, young people, trouble coming out and so on, exactly like I did. I started training in gender identity clinic, but, the rules were you needed another half to your to one's internship year, and that other half was in a sexual behaviors clinic where they saw a lot of sex offenders. I was never planning on doing that. All of that really kind of seemed very bizarre to me, but I needed another half. Yeah, I needed another rotation. But once I got there, by sheer coincidence, they were planning on doing some brain-based studies on pedophiles and people with other atypical sexualities. Well, I was interested in what made anybody interested in whatever they're interested in. And I had a technical background, doing neuroscience. 25 years goes by. I'm now head of that senior scientist, head of that research lab. And, we spent a generation, from brain scans and looking for other clues. In their case, it was largely about what made a pedophile a pedophile. But of course, really to a scientist, I was interested in the big question. What makes anybody interested in whatever they're interested in? There already were labs looking at heterosexuality versus homosexuality. So I became known for, the brain-based studies and the biological-based studies on the rest of it, pedophilia, and, now starting to look at the other atypicalities. So really, it's been, as I say, a stack of studies, and I got to work with some really, really talented people throughout the world. And, now versus 20 years ago, where we used to think that, people just kind of picked or learned or were trained in whatever their sexual interest patterns are, we've now come the full circle. Now it seems like all of these, especially the highly atypical patterns, are really all brain phenomena. So as I say, so my trip has been fascinating, and I've gotten, to participate in some, I will say fascinating, but also, a lot of controversial questions that, evoke a lot of emotions in a lot of people. So being able to get this information out and into society where it can be used, for example, to prevent cases of sexual abuse, now again, I get to contribute what feels like a social good on top of, asking some fascinating questions.
Yeah, I'm really glad you meant there's a word there, controversial. And I think more and more so anything around sexuality, sexual orientation, whatever it may be, is becoming controversial. And if you even just touch it, it will scorn you. And I just feel, it's funny. I was saying to you just before the podcast, people now know, but I've had dealings with a paedophile in my own family. And yet, even when I bring it up to my friends, a lot of them say, oh, please, I really can't talk about that. It's just too much. I don't know how you can bear it, blah, blah, blah. And I always feel like it's the other way around. Surely, if I'm the one who's kind of had to deal with it, I should be the touchy one, and you should be the more calm and be able to have the conversation. But I think especially sexual abuse and pedophilia specifically is such like this topic where we've almost given it this monstrous kind of shadow, and we can't bear to even talk about it, look at it, think about it. And ultimately it's not working, because if it were working, I wouldn't be talking to you, as lovely as you are, and I wouldn't have had the problem that we've had in our family. So I wanted to have this conversation because I think it's needed. I think people need to understand, and maybe through that understanding, that scientific understanding you can give us, that could maybe offer, and this is going to sound really weird, but a level of compassion, or better yet, empathy, that could help us try to deal with this situation better than we already are, because clearly what we're doing is not working. With that in mind, Jim actually said before we got on with the podcast to kind of talk about, could you differentiate the orientation and all of that, those words that now we find really kind of touchy, kind of what they mean scientifically speaking, before we get going on anything controversial?
Yes, all of that's true. And there's also a lot to unpack in there. Forgive my kind of aging brain if I don't get to each point. The first one is, I really have to tip my hat to you. To anybody who has been, affected by child molestation, sexual abuse, it's really, I'm a scientist, and as I've told a lot of audiences, thinking about topics like this, controversial and emotionally laden topics in general, require us to tap our inner Vulcan. The emotionality is, of course, we're human. All of that is perfectly understandable. But the anger and the depression, a lot of that emotion just makes it harder to talk about the topic in a reasoned, effective, policy-oriented way. Now, again, because I have not been affected, directly by these kinds of issues, I have a chance to do that. But for somebody who has really, suffered at the hands of these issues and still able to keep their emotions, in check in order to take a rational, all right, how do we fix this problem so it doesn't get passed forward? That takes a level of self-discipline and mindfulness and mental health that is quite rare, and frankly countercultural. Most of society, especially on social media, is, if nothing else, indulgent in whatever their emotions are, however understandable those emotions are. But as I say, people are letting that get in the way of their thinking in a way that hasn't happened before. So I really, you have conquered a beast that few people are able to, and I really, really have to tip my hat to you.
Thank you for that.
It's well deserved. The idea of this being controversial and that people don't want to talk about it, again, is a side effect of that emotionality. And, I understand where people are coming from. People these days especially have no role models for how to have a difficult conversation. Everything is my side yelling at your side, everybody, painting each other as the more extreme and saying whatever, most extreme things they can think of because it gets them the most retweets. Actually finding the areas on which we agree, disagree, look up the facts where we disagree, having an actual, targeted, aimed conversation at solving this problem long term. People are not interested in solving the problem. People are interested in demonstrating how good, how virtuous, their particular side is, and just, getting rid of anybody who disagrees. Now, when somebody is confronted with, a genuine conversation, somebody like you described, where you want to talk about it with the people around you, and people just, again, I understand where they're coming from. They have no role models for how to have a difficult conversation. So people are just kind of backing out of it rather than genuinely educate me, tell me, what is your point of view? They, feel like, oh, this is so radioactive. I'm worried about how I'm going to look if I do not demonstrate, just how, affected I am by it. By, oh my goodness, I got the vapors. This is such a tough. That's not how to deal with the topic, and that's not how to prevent abuse.
Yeah.
So again, you're serving as that role model in a way that I think will and can do society an enormous amount of good. What I discover myself in that conversation, again, is to acknowledge where people's emotions are. I get where they're coming from. But if we instead, give them what's essentially permission to talk about the topic, now all of a sudden people really do want to know. They really do want to help. They just, as I say, they need what has disappeared in society, which is role models for how to have a rational conversation rather than an emotionally laden one. So again, that's where I keep using my phrase, tap your inner Vulcan, take a deep breath. And what I find over and over and over again with audiences is it really just takes two basic facts about how to think about the entire situation. And then all of a sudden I get, oh, and it starts making sense. People can actually start having a rational conversation about it just by giving oh, I get it now. Those two factoids are, one, pedophilia is not a synonym for child molestation. Now, of course, I understand where people get that misinformation. The only time we ever hear about pedophilia is when there is a case of child molestation that's in the news. So, naturally, these have become synonyms in the public mind. They're not. Pedophilia is a sexual orientation pattern. These people are genuinely sexually attracted to children the way the rest of us are sexually attracted to adult women, adult men. They didn't ask for it. It's the result of brain structure, and they cannot change it. That's different from child molestation. Child molestation is the behavior. This is what harms a kid. This is the crime. That's what must be prosecuted. Not all pedophiles are child molesters. There's no way we can get a survey, so it's not like we can figure it out. But we have every reason to believe that only a minority of people genuinely attracted to children ever actually act on it. Just because they're a pedophile does not mean that they're a child molester, and vice versa. And this we do know. The great majority, the majority, 2/3-ish of child molesters are not actually pedophiles. They actually are more attracted to adults than they are to children, but they use a child as a surrogate, because the child was in the environment and manipulable, and they didn't have contact with an adult. That's the most common, for example, within incest patterns, which again happens much more commonly than the pedophiles who, the ones who do offend do it outside of the family. It's not the cluster of variables are unlike the incest situation. The bottom line is not all pedophiles are child molesters. Not all child molesters are pedophiles. And people are, aiming at the criminals, the ones who have committed crimes, as if they were the people who, no, a lot of these people are just born, come to figure it out, when they're 12, 13, 14, getting crushes on 12, 13, 14-year-olds, just like everybody else, nobody notices. But by the time they start hitting, 18, 19, 20, and they're still getting crushes on 13, 14, it's only then in adulthood that they're realizing that, oh, something's up. That's now different from a gay person growing up who realizes that they were different, pretty much from the get-go. So really what we want to do in order to prevent pedophiles becoming child molesters is to make it as easy as possible for these people to come in to therapists, get therapy, sex drive reducing medications. They're not going to be able to join a, coming out group, for gays and lesbians the way that, I and my people could. Right. Yeah. They need a professional, with real confidentiality. If we want to actually help, we need to make it easier for these people to get help. But all we're actually doing with the overreactive policies is making it practically impossible. We're putting up, mandatory reporting legislation, which to an expert, I know this pedophile, and I am qualified to say that this pedophile is not putting anybody at risk. The average mental health person, the average psychologist, the average social worker does not have that background. Now, of course, they're in legal danger if they don't report when they should, but nothing happens if you report when you don't have to. So, of course, people respond to the pressure, default to reporting. The people who want to come in and get therapy know that. So what happens? They don't come into therapy. So instead of having a pedophile, getting support, sex drive reducing medications, whatever it is that's appropriate to their case, instead we have pedophiles out circulating in society with absolutely no supervision to anybody. There, feel better?
Yeah.
We're making the situation worse at the same time as congratulating ourselves at how bad we're being to those potential bad guys, again, who haven't actually done anything and are working hard to stay that way. Twitter is banning, conversations that, would help these people get to support groups where, again, the number one thing we know about, how to help a person not commit any kind of crime, child molestation or otherwise, is having, pro-social contacts. But we're cutting off all of their opportunities to have exactly those contacts. We're making the problem worse in our hysteria. So as I say, so the number one big rule that people get wrong, but once they understand, all of a sudden things start to fall in place, is that pedophilia is not a synonym for child molestation. Although, it's like this, classic Venn guy, there's overlap, but these are distinct and minority overlap. The other one is that pedophilia is not a choice. All the evidence indicates over and over and over, study after study after study, this is a brain thing. They are born with it the way the rest of us are born with, attraction to adults, men or women, or whatever it is that they're attracted to. They cannot change it. No amount of therapy is going to turn somebody, from a pedophile into a non-pedophile. All we can do is help give these people the tools to deal with this sexual interest pattern that they did not ask for and cannot change. Now, what's amazing is that as that evidence was emerging, the pedophiles themselves says, we knew it. Nobody was listening to them. And in, classic days of both psychoanalysis, where everything was about relationship with mother, or in the heavy behaviorism days, everything was, whatever you were learned and was reinforced when you were a kid. No evidence for it, never was. It was just the going psychological theory at the time. But now that the evidence is rolling in, they're born with it. This is a brain thing. If there's going to be a method of prevention, it's finding out how that chain of events starts and preventing it back then. So if we actually want to do prevention, again, it's going to be science. But people don't want to put money and resources into this kind of science exactly because of the controversy surrounding it. And people are afraid of accidentally looking like, not really looking like that they're supporting pedophiles, but if that they don't, with the correct amount of weight, condemn everything attached to it, that they will be mistaken for somehow supporting child molestation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, that myth is actually preventing us from doing meaningful research on it.
Yeah.
So
it's funny you say that, because I was actually talking to Jim just before this podcast, and we were saying, how do we kind of get into this topic and blah, blah. And I said, look, Jim, I actually have, the only reason I have the confidence to have this conversation with you and is because of my previous personal experience, because otherwise I would fear being called a pedophile sympathizer or something along those lines. And it's just such a hard, I mean, you talked about Twitter. I followed your feed. I was scrolling down, and almost all of your tweets that were yours, that you hadn't retweeted someone else, almost all of your tweets, Twitter said, they blocked them and they said, sensitive content, changing your settings if you want to. And this is obviously something that's inbuilt in Twitter, because I've never touched my settings on Twitter ever, so it must be a default setting. And I thought, look, this is an expert who, whatever you were sharing, might be articles or whatever, I don't think you were saying like, way, pro-pedophilia, yeah, woohoo, like you were just sharing whatever the science is showing. And that was deemed sensitive content that even though I'd pressed follow on your account, I wasn't allowed to see unless I went into my own settings. And I think that kind of encapsulates it perfectly how, as a society, we see this whole situation.
It's a rough call. Now, again, it's because I am sitting on top of 25 years of research and that I know exactly what the truth is and what is a myth, or at least what the evidence is and what is mere rumor. But society today, more than ever before, just not interested in the right answer. We're interested in our images. We're interested in how we look to our followers. The right answer, controversial, not controversial.
Yeah.
Now, of course, I'm a sex researcher. You know, sex research has been controversial since there has been sex research. But, and I say this often, so sex research among the sciences is a canary in this coal mine. What does it say about, pick your point of view, where the scientists are the ones that people are getting cautioned about, but the people who know the least can say whatever they want, wherever they want, whenever they want. That's exactly how we produced the public mistakes between pedophilia and child molestation, the public misconceptions about how it worked, and the passage of all of these overreactive laws, which, you know, as the experts keep saying, are probably making things worse. And so, right. Now, you're the first person to tell me that I was getting labeled with a sensitive content material on that. I don't know if that's a relatively recent change in Twitter. Ironically, Twitter itself has recently come out with a new policy, which fine. But they made the, big cardinal mistake in the last, I don't remember if there were 10 of these, but let's say 10 commandments. And, commandment number 10 was the mix-up. The first set of them were all about, perfectly legitimate stuff. They were talking about, how Twitter cannot be used for essentially the manipulation of children, sexualized child images and so on. So it was about, how Twitter cannot be involved in actually illegal behavior. Fine. That's about child molestation, child porn, with you. The last line, however, all of a sudden was about pedophilia and the wrong definition. All of a sudden they said people weren't allowed to discuss pedophilia as a sexual orientation or things that would normalize it. Okay, can somebody give me a definition of normal? Because in science, we don't yet. Normal? We've been pointing out, especially when it comes to sex, anybody got a workable definition of normal? We're all ears. Now, normalize. What does that mean? We redefine a scientific concept. All of science is exactly about removing the judgmentalism that is, and all of this again. And is this actually going to prevent child molestation, the ultimate goal? or actually facilitate it. Again, all that this is well meant, well intended, kind of more image oriented rather than fact oriented towards the end. But again, this is going to make things worse. We want pro-social pedophiles to be able to, how do you deal with it? What doctor do you go to? How do I deal with it? What have you used? Rather than, as I say, everything we know about, how to modify human behavior and encourage pro-social behavior is exactly the opposite. So as I say, Twitter has just come out with this new policy a week or two ago. Experts all over the world are now assembling various letters and petitions to say, nope, you've messed it up at the end. So I wouldn't be surprised if now all of a sudden, as part of that, right? If this is new, again, it's the American elections. They've made a lot of changes recently for labeling information, misinformation. Right, so it could be part of that. But as I said, this is you're the first one to tell me that they've labeled it. But there's
hopefully
some
the last. Not likely, but hopefully.
Well, I want to do what I always want to do. How can I make this into a joke? It's a lot of my friends, think that I should walk around with a sensitive content warning, although it's although we passed it, that probably would have made a great Halloween costume for me. If, just a T-shirt with it. That said, I am talking about sexual topics, and there are people, for whom many parts of society want there to be age controls on that. Again, so there is a certain sensitivity that society has that, in order to be a scientist about controversial material, I necessarily have to tune that out. Otherwise, it affects my objectivity, or it makes it harder to remain objective about these kinds of topics.
I just want to jump in just before Jim gets out. I know Jim has a load of questions, and but one thing I just want to clear up. You mentioned that sexual orientation, and you often hear it in the discourse that it's lumped in with being gay, and obviously for very obvious reasons that is incredibly upsetting for a gay person to hear that they're kind of being lumped in with pedophilia. And so we now in the public discourse we try to differentiate, and we don't call pedophilia a sexual orientation because we don't want to lump it in with heterosexuality, homosexuality, and so forth. Just scientifically speaking, could you clear that up for us?
Sure. This is one of those areas where, the public uses the word sexual orientation the way they usually hear the word sexual orientation. And the public only hear it, with regard to homosexuality, straight gay.
Mm-hmm.
People have just been started to use the word sexual orientation because it was fewer syllables than gay, lesbian, bisexual, and then we switched to letters, and now we just keep tacking on more letters. But to a scientist, the term is broader than that. In science, calling something a sexual orientation just means that you were born with it. This is in the brain. You didn't pick it, and it's not going to change. This is the kind of sex to which you are oriented. Now, it is unfortunate, and again, I get a little bit of leeway, in talking about it because I am openly gay. That it's not again, because I say it, people will think about it the extra second. Calling pedophilia sexual orientation is not, a repetition of, the old stereotype about, gay men being a greater risk to molest children. That's where that comes from. Although that doesn't get talked about nearly as much. That myth doesn't get spoken today as nearly as much as it used to. Today is much more about an exaggerated version of political correctness. So again, to a scientist, pedophilia, and now it looks like most of the atypical sexualities, the profoundly atypical sexualities, all of these things appear to be, an innate, inborn, not going to change with any kind of therapy, and the only thing that anybody can do with any of these is to learn as healthy a way as possible to, integrate these into their lives. If we're lucky, our sexual interest pattern is one that can be expressed, in the real world with a consenting partner. If you're straight, you get, roughly 50% of the world. If you're gay, you get roughly 2% of the world. If you're into amputees, And there are
Yeah.
some situations where there isn't anybody, like the pedophiles, or people who are interested in, again, any of the other many, many atypical sexualities that are not act outable in the real world. A lot of people who are into a lot of kinks, getting beaten up, doing the beaten up, they want to do it and do it in a consenting situation. But again, they're just kind of imitating what it is they actually want to do. So we approximate same thing. It's just that the pedophiles are in the situation where there's nobody who can consent in a perfectly right. Now, again, this is to those of us who are gay and realized, we're different from the rest of society. Oh, this, is going to be tough the way it looks in the beginning. What we had to go through now, what was a piece of cake next to what they go through. We are essentially asking these people what choice is there to live their entire lives celibate, without telling a single soul, even a shrink. Talk about a curse.
Yeah.
Right. Now, again, it feels weird to be able to say that, to put yourself in a mindset like that and find you're being sympathetic. They didn't ask for it. They were born like this. They couldn't change it. And the only thing is, all right, not even pornography that they like it, because that then, harms the... Imagine, but that's what they're being asked to do. And we in society, right, what if we want them to remain celibate, we need to make that as easy as possible. Come into therapy, anonymous situations, whatever it takes for sex drive reducing medic. But instead, we just put up wall after wall after wall and expect these people, right, and zero tolerance for a single slip. I even feel funny using the word slip. A slip means a kid gets hurt.
Yeah.
But right, and we are tilting the entire thing against them and whoever turns out to be the victim. Right, it's crazy. But that is exactly what we're doing, because in general, it makes, I'm now saying us, the voter, feel better about, I'm showing, what a tough guy I am to the bad guys. You're making it worse.
Dr. James, you said you're sitting on 25 years of research. And for people listening who are still a bit skeptical, is there pieces of research that you use to really hit home, or like the most profound pieces of research that you say, like, this has cemented my view on sexuality?
I hesitate to say one.
Okay.
Because, the brain is complicated, sex is complicated, behavior is complicated, and it's very rare for one study to ever show. It's not like, we can point to the telescope, oh my God, there's a blip where there shouldn't be one. There's the whatever it is we were trying to observe. If I had to pick a particular smoking gun, if I can use that expression, it would be the identification of handedness.
Okay.
That now, when we started doing this, so the research, it was successive approximation, zeroing in, until we got closer and closer, and then able to take actual brain scans. The actual brain scans, told us, what parts of the brain or what systems were in the brain of the brain were different in these people. What we found was a total surprise. In retrospect, we should have predicted it. None of us did. What looks like is affected is the cabling tissue that wires together the various parts of the brain that as a group form the sex response network. Whatever it is that the brain uses to identify, aha, that's sexy, go reproduce with it and trigger the response, it's the white matter, it's the cabling tissue that, assembles that network into a single cohesive system. It's that connectivity that seems to be off. But of course, when I take the brain scan, I'm taking the brain scan of the person in adulthood. That doesn't tell me when the person's brain became different. The prior studies that showed, again, they're physically shorter, proportions of the body are a little bit different, things that don't change really in adulthood. But handedness, There's one and only one thing that controls human-handedness, and that's which hemisphere of the brain is dominant. And it's crossed. Left-handed people, and I'm one of them, we have a right hemisphere dominance usually, and reverse in everybody else. Right-handed people are left hemisphere dominant, which is usual in people. If, however, in brain development, once the dominant hemisphere grows faster, that's how it becomes dominant. If, however, something goes off during development that interferes, poor nutrition, maternal stress, whatever, that interferes with the growth of that, the other hemisphere starts to compensate. It speeds up its growth and starts taking over functions that would otherwise be taken over by the other hemisphere. One of those things happens to be handedness. So in people who are non-right-handed, technically, ambidextrousness and goes with left-handedness in this. So when we find a preponderance, instead of it being the 10% base rate that it is in the population, instead it was over 30% of the pedophiles. The only way we could see a shift like that would be if there was something going on and it was different before birth. Handedness does not change in adulthood. Even in the old Catholic school model, they didn't change to left-handed, they changed to right-handed.
Right.
So again, the only way to explain that this handedness difference existed, to explain this handedness difference, is if there were substantial brain differences, and if those differences began before birth. And then, so on top of that, when we line up all of the other things that we found different, IQ functioning, memory functioning, clumsiness, head injuries, other things, again, but whatever the chain of events is that leads to pedophilia, the first links of that chain have to have been before birth. And so really, even though it's this very modest variable, the implications of handedness were profound.
I mean, you've emphatically said it, and I know you've already said it, but just to go over the point, it cannot be a learned behavior then, because one of the excuses I gave my uncle, and I don't know if this is true or not, but the excuse that I gave and the excuse that you often hear in public discourse is they were molested as a child. And so, and I never knew, I don't know categorically if he was molested as a child, but there was always the family rumor was he and his dad didn't get on very well. So what that means, who knows? But hey, so I deducted from that, well, he was maybe molested as a child and it's a learned behavior. But what you're saying is that may be true for a kid molester, child molester, but not for a pedophile. Is that the distinction?
Yes. The pattern that the literature shows is not so much that being a victim of sexual abuse makes one more likely to commit sexual abuse. The overall pattern is that chaos begets chaos. People who grew up in difficult circumstances, whether it's sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, are more likely to engage in, those kinds of poor parenting behaviors, if I can refer to it that way, with their own kids. And it could be sexual abuse, it could be physical abuse, it could be neglect. There is no like makes like association where the sexual abuse is more likely to beget sexual abuse, in a way that would suggest a learning process. Really, what we seem to see is that in chaotic childhoods, people don't form, self-restraint skills as much as other people. So when they face the stresses of parenthood in later life, they are more likely to express in, antisocial ways, whatever, emotions it is, whatever, violent or abusive instincts that they themselves are feeling. So it's that behavioral disinhibition that appears to go from generation to generation, rather than actual pedophilia, the sexual attraction pattern going from generation to generation. It's just that, if one happens to be pedophilic or have, any other sexual atypicality, if one is going to express it inappropriately, then that's going to be the behavior that they're more likely to express inappropriately. But there's no good evidence to have suggested. The nickname for it is, we called it the abused abuser hypothesis. that being the victim of abuse made one more likely to commit it. But in none of the follow-up studies, but that wasn't the pattern really that emerges from follow-up studies. It's much more, chaotic childhoods beget chaotic adulthoods seems to be the pattern.
Dr. James, obviously it wasn't too long ago where homosexuality was considered a sickness, and that maybe we need to fix these people or something like this. And do you think that people who consider pedophiles as these sick people and we need to fix this, is it a similarly fruitless endeavor to an extent in the hope that they can fix them in terms of change their orientation rather than fix them as in give them tools to deal with what their current situation or their identity?
I don't know if I would have used the word homosexuality and fruitless in the same sentence. There you go. Now you got the joke. It's a tough question and not entirely a scientific question, although it's about how and when to apply science. Now, whether the history is complicated, and I'm trying not to jump into a big philosophical discussion. There are certain undeniable similarities between the idea of trying to turn a gay man into a straight man and turning a pedophile into a non-pedophile. Again, these are in the brain, they're born with it, and it makes, people uncomfortable for different reasons. Again, so a certain parallel to it. Now, of course, that parallel starts to fall apart when, gay men can have sex with other gay men, go have a good time, use a condom, go on PrEP, and so on and so on. Where with pedophiles, we don't have that option. Where just living, gay, openly gay, engaging in gay behavior, perfectly harmless, engage in safe sex, please, and go nuts. That option isn't true for pedophiles. The idea, again, the alternative, the goal, if I can call it that, would be to live a celibate life. So the idea of, is this person better off, undergoing, if there were such a thing, a conversion therapy for pedophilia, that now, is in a very, very different political context than in, if I can call it that, plain vanilla homosexuality, where just, have a good time is an option. For pedophiles, that's not there. So the idea of converting them, happens in a very different balance of how good is this for the client patient and how good is this for society, where for homosexuality, it's, should be irrelevant to society. So the ethical questions are, as I said, are different. That the pluses and minuses fall in a different pattern. Now, a lot of gay men, when we were kids, will often have described, a desire to have engaged in such a therapy, mainly because we didn't want to be different from the people around us. We want to fit in the way that kids want to fit in. And then, some of us, as we grow up, actually learn to embrace the way that we're different from the rest of the world, and to embrace the diversity that it provides any group. Now, with pedophiles, if a pedophile comes in and says, "Doc, I want to be converted," well, if it's a gay person, I have a meaningful option to turn them into a well-adjusted, deal with it, go have a good time gay man. Yeah. I don't really exactly have that option with with a pedophile. So the pluses and minuses, social and personal, professional benefit falls in a different way. Whether it counts as a disorder, whether anything counts as a disorder, is part science and part value judgment. And neither one is ever going to give us a complete answer. Science is never going to be able to say anything more than, we have found, biologically significant, differences, therefore it forms a taxon or a dimension of difference, amongst humans. All right, that's the scientific end. Whether that counts as a disease, well, that's now value judgment. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. The current official, manual, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual from the American Psychiatric Association, and now the World Health Organization, their equivalent manual is going in the same direction, are dividing atypical sexualities from disorders of atypical sexualities. Just being attracted to children does not qualify you for pedophilic disorder. To qualify officially for the diagnosis of pedophilic disorder, you have to be attracted to children, but it also either has to cause you distress, you have to be upset by it, or you actually engaged in the behavior. You actually molested a child and it's causing harm in society. So those would be, you have to now in this new version since 2013, I think it was, you need one of those in order to qualify for the diagnosis. So if a person has, adjusted, learned to integrate in a healthy way, that they are interested in children, not hurting anybody, they would be a pedophile, but they would not qualify for the disorder, pedophilic disorder. They would not qualify for an official diagnosis. That distinction actually was a brilliant addition to the DSM. It was suggested by Ray Blanchard, one of the real kings of this field. Anyway, so now if a pedophile comes in and wants to change, I have to tell him what the limitations are of the science. But, now in a theoretical way, if we developed such a technology that would turn a pedophile into a non-pedophile, do I treat this like conversion therapy for homosexuality and say, nope, sorry, we leave all of this alone. This is how you were born.
Yeah.
Do I help them convert? Do I help them integrate it? Those are legitimate and complicated, but now ethical and philosophical rather than scientific questions. Even harder, and I got a tweet from somebody anonymously, but acknowledged that they themselves were attracted to children. I often point out that it's the brain research is going to be ultimately, if we ever find a way of preventing the development of pedophilia, it's going to come from brain research, and then prenatal testing, if we can now project into the future. All right, now mothers and parents have a question. Abort the kid? Is there an intervention we could use to make this condition less likely to develop in the first place? We're now starting to talk about a little bit of genetic engineering-ish kind of thing again. And we're here with our moral values. Do we do that if the kid is more likely to develop to be gay or pick yours or kinky or pedophilic? Now we're in a rough situation. So as I say, for the first time, I got a message from somebody who is a pedophile. At first, thanking me for this, for doing this research, and confirming, as I say, so many pedophiles say it. We knew it. They just say, they report that they feel like they were born this way. But to question, hey, if I were aborted, I wouldn't exist. Is that really, is that fair?
Yeah.
Legitimate question.
Very, very. Dr. James, you've spoken about celibacy, and it's such a, how can I put this? When I was doing some research, and when I found out that anger wasn't the way to deal with the situation, I tried to be more understanding, which led me to a few Google searches. And before I knew it, I was down this rabbit hole. One of those Google searches where I found you, but another one was where I found this online community of pedophiles who, I don't want to put the website out there because I don't want them to get hate, but who basically they would use it as a forum, and they would just express. And obviously, for me, it was hard to read, but I tried to read as much as I could. And they're people saying I'm attracted to whatever it may have been, specifically 12 to 14-year-old boys. This, blah blah. I would never dream of it. I'm a nanny, but I really attracted to the boy, but I'd never touch them, this, that, and the other. And a part of me, I felt really sorry for them. I truly did, because I thought, oh, these poor people, they have no one. And they would say, I can't tell my friends, I can't tell my parents, because I'll be a social leper, which obviously is completely understandable. And I felt really sorry for them. However, my empathy or my sympathy for them was then counteracted with the thought of, Christ, if someone told me, Seb, you have to be celibate, and this is being purely honest, I don't think I could do it. I could do it for maybe a certain while, but I don't like, luckily my thing is accepted in society. I have a girlfriend and no one questions me about it, and that's brilliant. But if someone told me you can't touch these women ever, and even to look on porn about it is disgusting, I think I would cave in. And so my question to you is, as a therapist who has sessions with these people, how do you, without using chemical castration, or do you use chemical castration, how do you put these people back into society with a certain assuredness that they won't ever offend, and it's just a personal affliction that will never cause anyone else ever any harm? And secondly, how do you tally that responsibility? Because for you, I must imagine that must weigh so heavily to go home and to think, Christ, I've just spoken to Bob and I'm really not sure if Bob can actually manage this. How do you do that?
Excellent questions. First, let me tweak the phrase you used. These aren't, sending people back into society. The ones who come to me, now in a private clinic, are the ones who, they never were in jail. They never, committed a crime. They are coming to me specifically for help, dealing with the stresses that are associated with. In the research end of my career, that was specifically within, a forensic department of psychiatry, working with people who were offenders. So I've run the gamut. The situation, though, you're asking, talking to a person, helping them deal with it, again, those are really, those are not offenders. Those are people, I was about to say working the hardest not to offend, but the ones who come into me, that's not really the question. They're not, anywhere close to what I would even call a borderline. The situation, usually the emotional state that they come in with, I don't get people coming in expressing trouble controlling themselves. That's not the issue. They come in having depression and anxiety, having difficulty dealing with the loneliness and the isolation that's associated with it. That's what they're coming in. It's because they're not in contact with a community of peers. They can't tell their friends. They can't tell their parents. So if they happen to be, in Toronto, they're in the one city, having done exactly the same kind of search that you did, finding, oh my God, there is somebody who understands that, not every person attracted to children acts on it. Oh my God, they're in my city. Or these days we're doing everything online, so anywhere in the province. So those are the ones coming to me. So as I say, it's not really a question of putting them back in society. The ones seeing me are already in society, and the ones not seeing me are also already in society. Now, they're already for doing what you were hinting to is what we call a formal risk assessment. And that is indeed, part of a clinician's and a licensed expert's job, is that if the difference between when I do need to call the police or whatever the appropriate authority is, this is part of the legitimate part of mandatory reporting. I am not required to report because somebody is attracted to children. I'm required to report when I have reasonable basis to believe that there is a child in need of protection. So if this guy, is on the border of actually doing something, I am, and I will, I am required to report that, and that is perfectly appropriate. But that's not the situation with which people come in, with which people come into me within a private practice setting. In public hospitals, where people who have committed offenses and are therefore at an elevated risk, to commit new offenses, those, again, we have formal ways of calculating the probabilities, large groups of people of various characteristics followed up, and we get to see which characteristics predict, the greatest probability of future offenses. Now, of course, I'm well trained in that, and I am competent and therefore confident, in making such predictions. But bottom line is, sooner or later, how does anybody, any psychologist, any licensed mental health professional deal with any of that? That's part and parcel of the responsibility that we have, and why we require the kind of training that we do. Is that that is part of it. Now, again, in private practice, people are self-filtered. These are people, with jobs, educations, insurance that cover psychotherapy and so on, which is different from people who are under the care of psychiatrists and public healthcare systems, under the medical systems in hospitals, which are people who usually have fewer resources and are in more dire straits to begin with. With those, the risk is higher. It is interesting to note, important to note, of the people who commit offenses, again, they're the ones most likely to commit new offenses, 10 to 15%. Once a person is apprehended for having committed a sex offense, comparatively few, as I say, 10 to 15% will commit new such offenses. There's a small number of, psychopathic serial offenders. Those are the dangerous ones. For the others, they're more, people who were tempted, slipped, and, once smacked with the system, oh my God, what did I do? And are actually very unlikely to do it again. The lesson that I wish most of mental health would learn, and policymakers probably, policymakers too, or often the same group of people. People do the most desperate things when they feel the most desperate. But rather than help them deal with that desperation, we just keep passing laws that increase their desperation. We just keep cutting them off from the kind of things that, as I say, would put them in contact with competent clinicians, wherever those clinicians may be, or cut them off from communication on Twitter or the websites you're mentioning. I will mention two websites. One, two community groups of people who, they're anonymous, but they, again, acknowledge their attractions to children. I'm going to mention these two mostly to contrast them. The one that I like and I endorse over and over again, all over the place. I send people, contacts from all over the world who get in touch with me. The Virtuous Pedophiles.
That's the one that I saw. Yeah.
VIRPED.
That's what
VIRPED.org. I cannot endorse them, strongly enough. These are people, as I say, are aware, acknowledge their sexual interests, and support each other in not committing offenses. They, as I say, I've gotten to meet many of them, mostly electronically, and they are exactly what they say they are. And there have now been, they are now actually a source of research data. As other scientists have now, started recognizing this population and saying, oh, we can study pedophilia from the non-offenders, now adding to what we know about people who were recruited from forensic institutions, so now we're getting to see what's general to pedophilia and what is, specific to criminality and so on, or stress and so on.
Yeah.
So that group I heartily endorse, and they have very, very strict rules, and they take them very, very seriously about no contact with children, no circulation of inappropriate material and so on. They're serious. They're the real deal. And they're also very well policed. I'm not worried about their websites coming under attack. There's another group that I don't refer people to called Before You Act. Now, they actually precede by many years the VIRPED community, the VIRPED group. The reason that I don't endorse Before You Act the way that I endorse VIRPED is because the Before You Act basic philosophy, the philosophy of the founders, is much cagier. Rather than coming out and saying, no, child molestation is wrong, period, zero tolerance, like the VIRPEDs do, the Before You Act is cagey about, whether they would like the age of consent reduced. Rather than having a policy for it, it's before you act, know what the local laws are. So there's much more of a, we can't say it out loud, but wink, wink. Right. So I can't say that there's any particular philosophy about any particular person, and I don't want to generalize to every member of it. But as I say, I can and I do very strongly get behind VIRPED. Before You Act, no, that I'm uncomfortable.
Yeah. Dr. James, I wonder if you could clear up something. I was speaking to some friends, my girlfriend, we were talking about, there's it seems like there's two routes here. If you recognize you're a pedophile and you want to treat it, I was going to say, but manage it, I should say better. And it kind of felt like there's the therapy route and then there's the chemical castration route. And and this is just through public discourse, I came across, and this is kind of my own understanding until I researched a bit more, that kind of chemical castration, the best way I could put it, without researching into it, it felt like it was, well, if you like steaks, it's kind of like, we'll make you impotent, but you'll still have the same like. So it's like, we'll take away your hunger, but you're still going to like steaks, but you're never hungry enough to eat them. But you still, when you see them on the plate, you're like, oh, that's a beautiful steak. And it kind of felt like that was it. And then I researched more, and I was like, maybe that's not the case. But I just wanted to clear up with you, chemical castration, does it work? What is it? How does it work?
Chemical castration is a very dramatic term. I think it probably would be more descriptive, more accurately descriptive, if we spoke more generally about sex drive reducing medication. Now, sex drive, of course, reduces just with age. It's going to happen no matter what. Yeah. There are two main classes of drugs that reduce sex drive in men. One with only mild side effects, one with pretty substantial ones. The ones with relatively mild side effects are the SSRIs. Mostly they're used as antidepressants. Paxil, Prozac, that family of drugs. Right. One of the side effects of those drugs is that they reduce sex drive, and some people who take them as antidepressants or they have certain other purposes, complain that it reduces their sex drive or reduces their capacity to orgasm in a lot of people. So if you're depressed, research has shown that it's quite effective for that. And again, if you can tolerate the decrease in sex drive. If, however, you have a sex drive that is, making life tougher for you, well, then the reduction in sex drive is no longer a side effect. It's the effect you were going for. And now the side effect is antidepressant. Well, that's not so bad. Or again, many of these people are genuinely depressed, so a lot of them report, that they feel more comfortable on the drug than not. And again, I'm just, telling people what my own clients tell me, what the research says. But I'm not a physician. I can't give medical advice. The other class of sex drive reducing medications are the much more powerful ones, and they tend to get used really with people who are serial sex offenders or who have other major either psychiatric or medical conditions that make self-control in them unrealistic. Those are the anti-androgens. Those are the same drugs that we would give a man with prostate cancer. They're testosterone blockers, ultimately. And so that's, really what chemical castration is, and it shuts down sex drive. Without, testosterone in our system, they just don't have, the urges that the rest of us do. And they vary, it's not quite like a switch. It's there a little bit. Very often they report, erectile dysfunction. They can't get erections, never mind orgasms, depending on the dose, depending on the person and so on. And there do indeed exist people who say that they would rather live in that state because they find themselves less distracted by whatever stimulus it is that they find themselves attracted to. And that's a person-by-person decision. There's no good way. We don't have a good way to predict that. But of course, the side effects of that are quite substantial. For long-term use, osteoporosis, bone density loss, and so on. So one would tend to use it only in dramatic circumstances, but sometimes there do exist dramatic circumstances.
It's interesting. We've spoken there, and you've cleared it up for me, but we've spoken there about men. And that leads me on to my next question. When we talk about sexual abuse in general, we always think of it as a man. And then especially it feels like when we talk about pedophilia and child molestation, it almost feels exclusively that men do it. What does the science say? What does your experience say? I mean, I'm guessing that there are cases of women who have pedophilic tendencies.
There have been reports of female sexual abusers. Now, again, it is a small fraction relative to the biologically male sexual abusers. And they tend to be an otherwise typical, the technical word for attracted to adults is teleophilic. Or, people got tired of silly word, adultophilia. But the women do appear to be genuinely or more genuinely attracted to adults, but engaged in some, grossly inappropriate behavior with usually post-pubescent, mid-teenage male is the typical situation. Sexual contacts with a prepubescent child is very, 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 very rare in women. And when it does happen in women, it is almost always, in concert with, a set of other, again, very dramatic, profound other issues, very difficult personality disorders, psychiatric disorders. We question whether she was aware exactly of what it was she was doing. And of the people who, of the women who come in saying that they're attracted to prepubescent children, it's very, very often a question: are they actually, or is this a person who, again, with other mental health issues, who either has an obsessive fear that she might be a pedophile, but it's not. She has OCD, and she has an irrational fear that she's a pedophile, right, or will hurt a child, or is using that self-label for an unhealthy need for attention, like in borderline personality disorder or other personality disorders. So as I say, once we rule out the other much more probable situations, it really is a question how much, if any, people are left over. So there do exist people who engage in the behavior, but it's not so clear if how many, if any, are genuine pedophiles in the way that biological males are, profoundly and much more genuinely pedophilic. So I don't want to automatically rule it out, but I immediately have several questions, and I start skeptical because all of these other situations, where either the client patient themselves or their care providers are pushing for that diagnosis for some reason other than its accuracy. So I'm automatically skeptical, but there is no reason to say that it cannot exist.
Thank you for that. That's really interesting because, I just kind of assumed that we just didn't hear about it, but that, it's there just like anything else. But to hear that maybe not the case is, food for thought for sure.
It's like a lot of the situation. Once we separate, pedophilia from child molestation, a lot of the rest of it starts to make a lot more sense.
Yes, exactly that. See, now that we're talking, the more and more I think about it, the more I think my uncle is more a child molester than a pedophile. Coming down to what you've said, you said at the start that sometimes it's more linked, or the cases of the molestation is more incestuous, and it happens within the families. Is that purely opportunity? It's easier, you're always around them, you maybe have a certain level of confidence because it's your uncle, it's your granddad, it's whoever, or is it more sinister than that? Why is that the case?
I of course can't say anything specific to your situation or your uncle,
just in general.
But in that general pattern, but what you describe is the general pattern that we see, that because the kid is available, trusts the whoever it is more manipulable, is more likely to be obedient, sometimes cuddly, and so the behavior increases. For lack of a better term, pushing the envelope a little bit more each time. And again, for lack of a better term, successive approximation for what the offender is aiming for to begin with. That's a similar pattern of successive approximations also happens, however, amongst the serial offenders against people who, kind of automatically would be obeyed. Priests, teachers, people again who have access and, who have access now to a string of victims rather than a single one. Now, again, the majority, the great majority of incest offenders turn out not to be genuinely pedophilic, but there are some, so bets are off. And as I say, there's certainly no way I could know anything specific or could say anything specific to you or your uncle.
I'm really glad you brought up the priests there, actually, because that's something. Look, I'm Catholic. Well, grew up in a Catholic culture. Jim did as well. Italian and Irish. Probably can't get more Catholic than those two. And it's something that we've had grown up with. It's like, all priests are pedophilic. And I think that distinction that you made is that it's more likely than not the ones who've been caught. Yes, they're child molesters, and maybe there's a few in there who also meet the criteria of being a paedophile, but the majority, because you don't hear that. You don't hear, oh, priests are child molesters. You hear priests are pedophiles. It's almost like it just fits in together. It's lovely. And then we tarnish them all with the same brush. And I think if one thing we can learn from this podcast, there's many, but is that distinction between pedophilia and child molestation is something that I myself wasn't fully aware of and kind of used them interchangeably, to be honest.
I certainly can't fault you for it. As I say, people get this information, not from the research journals, but from when they see it in the paper. But, pedophile wakes up, goes to work, comes home, doesn't make it into the paper.
Yeah,
child molestation does. And to a lot of people, these are synonyms. They only see the two within the same story. So it's, as I say, I can understand where the mistake comes from. But the route to understanding and therefore preventing child molestation is understanding, the fundamental where it comes from on a fundamental level. What's going on in the priesthood, specifically the Catholic priesthood, I'll tweak that to say in institutions that require celibacy has not been studied a lot, or has not been studied, in an objective way much.
Right.
But I can't help but make what to me is obvious, but I'll say intuitive hypotheses. Now, it's also, and again, I have to play my, get out of jail-free gay card a bit. There is also, a very high overrepresentation of gay men who become Catholic priests. Again, being very careful that, old stereotype gay men, pedophiles, use these two terms carefully. That's why I have to play my card. I don't think there's any association between those two groups, but it is very, very easy to hypothesize that these are two different groups there for the same reason. They're there for the coverage of the oath of celibacy.
Right.
If you're a gay man and you don't want parents, friends, family asking, where's your wife? Why aren't you married? Where are my grandchildren? Becoming a priest is a socially acceptable way to accept the where's your girlfriend. Pedophiles have the same thing. They also have the where's your wife? Where are my grandchildren? And becoming a priest is a way socially acceptable to get out of the why I'm not dating, why I get out of these questions, but still circulate in society in a pro-social way. Again, I have no idea if that's true, and I can't imagine what kind of a survey would demonstrate it one way or another. But it is right; it's a pretty hard hypothesis to shake, and that also is again, now we're dealing with part rumor, part science. So many of the gay male priests end up going to bathhouses, having sex with each other, and nobody gets hurt. But the pedophiles, when they act on it, kids are getting hurt. But the attraction is not so much the priesthood, so much as the social coverage, the shield that comes from a public oath of celibacy.
Yeah, it's an interesting link to draw there. Jim, do you have any questions before I finish up here?
I guess it would be nice just to hit home again at what you would consider to be an ideal scenario or ideal future for pedophiles. Like I know you mentioned that policies that are ostracizing people are making people more vulnerable and harder to reach people. That's obviously preventing. That's obviously, yeah. I guess. Is there anything that you didn't mention or that I've forgotten to mention that you would hope for in the next few years that we could facilitate to decrease the number of sexual assaults and at least give unoffending pedophiles some sort of well-being, I guess?
That's an excellent question. Really, for the relative short term, really would be to undo a lot of the hysteria that has been done. Make it easier for these people to come in. Make it easier for people to get therapy. Make it easier for people to come in and get sex drive reducing medications. We want to protect their confidentiality so they can come in. We really need to conquer the idea of trying to make ourselves look good rather than actually, reduce the potential harm. We need to bring the mandatory reporting laws to, again, where they protect society rather than, protect our own reputations. We need, imagine if, a reasonable amount of money, I don't have a number in my head that went to, so there can be help lines that people could contact. Fund actual research for groups like VERPED, so we can do more of this kind of research and figure out how this ticks. Now that I brought up money, the amount of money in the U.S. that it costs to keep someone in one of these sex offender programs, segregated and so on, is well over $100,000 per person per year. My entire research program, all of the brain scans, was about the cost of one person in jail. If we prevented one case, this research would have paid for itself. But the science and the funding for the science is nowhere to be found. But when all of a sudden it's revenge, now money is no object. If we just put the resources in logical places, in genuine prevention rather than vengeance, imagine, how many lives we could save from, being ruined. So I would say, reverse the irrational parts of the mandatory reporting laws and make it possible for these people to come in and get help from the groups that have to provide it. Another group, and for anybody else looking for a therapist, especially in the U.S. Or Canada, the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers, ATSA.com. They maintain a referral list. So allowing, these groups to be able to communicate, allowing and facilitating these people to get into self-help groups like VERPED, all of that, we have every reason to suspect that what we know about crime prevention will work in these groups, and we need to apply it rather than our own emotionality, as, seductive as our anger can be.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's been I mean, really great for me and I hope for people who are listening. Before we let you go, you do some really hard work, sir, and it's needed, but I can't help imagine the toll it must take. And so I want to ask, who helps to help? How do you keep on top of your mental health? How do you stay in a fit state to help other people?
I really don't know. I can't say that I have the experience of it just weighs on me and weighs on me and weighs on me, and I have to go, blow off steam with my husband or other people. That's not my experience of it. My experience of it is much more, I think, average, like everybody else's. I'm very, very, very lucky. I'm surrounded by a loving family. I'm surrounded with a loving husband. I am surrounded by colleagues whom I trust and trust me, and that we're great friends. My friends are, critical thinkers and readers. So just, just being surrounded by people who like interesting ideas and who are unafraid of discussing them. That's really it. The thing that I find disquieting is not dealing with these difficult people. It's watching society's major institutions, major scholarly and academic institutions, having fallen one after another. Universities that are not protecting free speech. Speakers getting canceled at professional societies because they're saying something that's politically unpopular with a small handful of people. Scientific journals or professional societies saying things like avoid controversy. How are you going to solve anything when you're telling professional groups of psychologists, say, avoid controversy? Okay, let's take the people who have the most information and remove them from social media. Yeah, that's going to help society come up. That's what worries me. And I had to switch the picture that I use in my background on Twitter. It's Dagobah. I feel like Yoda after, the empire has fallen to the dark side, and I just have to escape, to my swampland and await the birth of a new hope in the new generation, because this one's lost.
Well, hopefully that birth of a new generation comes along soon and Yoda can return once more.
Imagine how old I'll be then.
Well, listen, you're holding up well now. You're holding up well. If I can look like you at your age, I'll be mighty pleased. Before you go, anyone who's listened to this and now think, oh, you know what, this has opened up a whole Pandora's box that I didn't really know about, and they want to read more, where can they find you and kind of your works and anything that you would recommend?
Sure. My website, although I'm due to update it, jamescantor.org.
Okay, perfect. We'll put all of that in the show notes. We'll put your Twitter in the show notes as well, so people can find you. I recommend following. And if Twitter says that it's sensitive content, go to your settings, people, and because it might be sensitive, but it's worth seeing. So thank you so much for your time, Dr. James. It's really, really been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure. I'm now thinking Twitter needs a setting, so just give me the sensitive material. Filter that in, get rid of that boring stuff.
Exactly. That's the spirit. Hopefully we can talk to you soon, but until next time, stay well.
My pleasure. Thank you. You too.
Hi, guys. Thank you for listening to the podcast. Please don't forget to subscribe and leave a 5-star review if you haven't already. Every review helps us climb the podcast charts so that even more of you can listen to our amazing guests. We really appreciate the support. Remember to tune in next week. But until then, keep safe and have a good one.